Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today?
Good morning, Frank. Enjoying the summer and keeping an eye on the news and very worried about what's going on with both the Palestinians and the Rohingya as two communities which we consider to be ethnic in their identities in very different parts of the world, who are what would be the best word? Certainly at a grave disadvantage because of their identity, and their identity has come to have a very different meaning in the last over the last few decades, or in the case of the Palestinians, longer than that, than it had before. And that brought to my mind a number of factors which are sort of one needs to compare with that in order to understand it. That identity is a factor of social change, and social change is the most significant factor in the process of globalization. Mm-hmm. And yet we don't talk very much about identity. We simply take it for granted. But if we're moving now in the process of globalization from a situation where not that long ago, everybody belonged to very small communities and identified themselves in terms of small communities, to a situation in which we're all members of one global community. How are we going to identify ourselves when we're members of one global community? So it's very interesting to see how this process has happened gradually, probably at an accelerating rate, and wonder just exactly how it's going to work out in a globalized world. Most people have been thinking of themselves in the last couple of hundred years as being citizens of a particular nation state, but since that worked reasonably well for the original nation states of Europe, it hasn't worked quite so well for nation states that have been created in other parts of the world, especially since the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And it's working particularly poorly, not really working at all, in one of the latest nation states to be created, which is South Sudan, mm-hmm. where the population rebelled against its inclusion in Sudan, which was governed by a majority that was Arabic speaking and had nothing to do with the people in the South. But then when the people in the South became a member, had their own state, they found that they didn't agree with each other either, and still are trying to work out how they can have one single ethnic identity or one single ethnic citizenship, which will work politically and economically.
Well, let me ask a question from a cultural perspective. Why is identity important? I mean, is it that people wish to associate with other people who think and feel and look the same way that they do, or is it something more broad than that allows people to function autonomously within under a protective umbrella, and they can be different from their neighbor and different from the next neighbor and different from the next neighbor? I mean, is there a natural human urge to associate with people similar, or is it enough to have a protective umbrella and all live heterogeneously, so to speak?
I'm glad you asked that question, because it's certainly something that we should explain. It starts off with the fact that we are social animals, and we don't, which is something that I think psychologists don't really understand well enough, that we function not as individuals, but as members of some sort of grouping. We are interdependent. And but your question, of course, is to what extent are we interdependent, and what size grouping do we need to belong to? And that depends partly on how many of us there are in any particular place,
Mm-hmm.
and partly on our economy, what we need, how much, how many of us need to work together in order to function efficiently in terms of what we need to do in order to live. But in fact, identity has been a function of larger and larger groupings in human history. I mean, it started off when we were foragers and didn't produce our own food up until about 10,000 years ago, or maybe a little bit more than that, when we it really had to do with location, how many people could live together in any particular place and find enough to eat.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we started to farm, then it depended more on what the resources were and how many people could live together and farm efficiently in a particular place. And then gradually, when we had to start irrigating, and everybody moved down to the rivers, and that meant that they farmed much more efficiently, produced much more food, the population grew, and we had the beginning of cities, and then identity became very different, because you were not only a member of the citizenship of a particular city, but in cities, people were not all producing their own food. They were all doing different things and started new occupations, and their identity was influenced by their occupation. And so they were a member of the urban community, but they were also one occupation rather than another occupation. And that, so that by the time we got to the 19th century in the industrial
Guilds.
Here, obviously it was class, which had something to do with occupation.
Mm-hmm.
However, between those two extremes, other things were going on, and one was when literacy made it possible for people to interact with each other remotely instead of just face to face. And at the end of the axial age, just not long before the beginning of our current common era, the new ideas of Confucius and Socrates, and then later Christianity, and later still Islam, began to spread in writing, and in much larger communities began to develop as religious communities. And so the medieval period, just before the modern industrial period, was a division of the world community as we knew it at that time between different religious communities. And then when that broke down with the Reformation, and we had a period of religious wars, that was finally resolved in terms of what we came to call nation states. And then the West, because of the colonial period, imposed nation states on the rest of the world. And we're still living with that, but the nation states aren't working so well anymore. And there's greater and greater interaction between people in different nation states as we proceed towards globalization. And we're not really sure how people are going to identify themselves in terms of who they need to interact with in order to live in a way that they understand to be meaningful in a globalized world. And just to finish this thread of argument, to make it more complicated, every different part of the world is at a different stage of this process, which is why the Palestinians and the Rohingya are left where they are at the moment, and why nobody's doing anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as the globalization process intensifies and the interactivity between people increases, that will either do one of two things. It'll either lessen the need for people to have identity with close-in groups, I suppose, being more at ease with having self-identification with larger, broader digital social platform type groups. Or what it's going to do is cause the need to have a identity dissipate significantly, because you're going to feel part of an overall whole as soon as you walk out your door, or as soon as you flip on your iPhone, or as soon as you turn on your TV. You're going to be part of an overall larger group. Now, from what you've just said, and I would agree with it, if this is what you were saying, that's not going to be enough. That's not going to be enough for human need to be able to have identity with a face on a screen, or with a text on a chat app or something. That's not enough.
Well, and to make it somewhat more complicated, family identity has been very important from the very beginning. And of course, to begin with, all communities were simply groupings of related families. And now, in the last 50 years or so, the family has been, the functioning of the family has been changing. And it's not clear, actually, what is going to happen to the family, because people can not only decide to what extent they want to reproduce as families in some sort of, what should we say, a way that has been legally recognized, but they can even decide what sex they want to be. So the whole basis of social organization and how you identify yourself in relation to the people that you interact with is going through a period now of more fundamental change than has ever happened before, and much faster.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, will have a corresponding effect on people's self-identity.
Yeah, and it's not seen in these terms, and that makes it even more problematic. First, that it's not seen in these terms, and secondly, that it's at a different stage in every part of the world, and it's mainly different not between the old religious communities like the Islamic community and the Christian community, but since Christianity and Islam were particularly important as factors of identity rather than as religions and faith as we think of them. Now, what is affecting what is influencing the people in the Islamic and Christian worlds is not so much their membership of a Christian or Muslim community, but the fact that they're living in cities, mm-hmm. and urbanization is accelerating, and soon, already over half the world's population lives in cities, and we expect by the middle of this century it will be 2/3 to 3/4 of the total world population living in cities. And that means that everybody is in much closer contact with much larger numbers of other people. And that's what is changing people's behavior. And so I now get information from Iran, which is the country that I spent a lot of time in, and that convinces me that the same sorts of things are happening in urban communities in the Islamic Republic of Iran as are happening in Europe and America. That is,
that's something.
People are less and less interested in religion, and they are less and less interested in marriage and the sort of gender relations which are ordained by religion, and the whole the quality of social life is changing.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. It's been another very interesting discussion on the last. I think this is going to be the last broadcast of the spring. The next one will be, in fact, in the summer. So, well, thank you very much, Professor Spooner, and we'll look forward to next week.
Good. See you then.
All right.